Trump's new tariff policy triggers strong domestic and international reactions. On April 4, President Donald Trump's new tariff policy sparked widespread controversy, both within the United States and internationally. The European Union, China, Japan, South Korea, Colombia, and Mexico have all voiced concern and pledged to respond accordingly. Bernd Lang, chair of the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, called the U.S. retaliatory tariffs unreasonable, illegal, and disproportionate. Canadian Prime Minister McCarthy said the policy would fundamentally alter the global trade system and seriously impact millions of Canadian citizens, even though Canada and Mexico were partially exempted under the USMCA trade agreement. In Europe, multiple leaders have expressed concern. The Swedish Prime Minister stated that Sweden would continue to stand for free trade. Norway's Minister of Industry warned that tariffs ranging from 10% to 20% would directly affect Norway's economy. Switzerland's president affirmed that swift measures would be taken to protect long-term economic interests. In Australia, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the U.S. tariffs were not surprising but were unjustified. He assured Australians that the government would fight to protect jobs, industries, consumers, and national values. In Asia, South Korea's president ordered emergency support for companies impacted by the tariffs, especially in the automotive sector, and instructed the Ministry of Industry to negotiate with Washington to reduce the damage. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and business leaders warned that the tariffs would severely harm Italian exports and its already struggling economy. Meloni hinted at possible retaliatory measures to defend Italy's interests, noting that the EU might need to implement coordinated countermeasures. In the US, Democratic lawmakers criticized the policy, arguing it burdens middle-class families while benefiting billionaires through tax cuts. The House of Representatives may soon vote to reject the tariff policy, despite Republican efforts to block such a motion. Meanwhile, some U.S. industry groups, like the Mining Association, voiced support for the tariffs. Earlier that day, European Central Bank, ECB, President Christine Lagarde warned that U.S. trade policies were fueling global instability. Speaking on Irish broadcaster News Talk, Lagarde said the tariffs could harm not only targeted countries but also those imposing them. She stressed the importance of EU solidarity and called the tariffs a wake-up call for Europe to assert more economic independence. French government spokeswoman Sophia Primas confirmed that the EU would respond to the new U.S. tariffs, with an initial reaction expected by mid-April regarding steel and aluminum duties. A second, more detailed response would follow before the end of the month. In Germany, the government warned of the mutual harm caused by trade wars. German government spokesman Stefan Hebestreit emphasized Berlin's willingness to negotiate with the U.S. on an EU-wide level to avoid escalation.
President Putin briefed on pipeline operation in Kursk. During a visit to the command headquarters in Kursk province on March 12, Russian President Vladimir Putin received a briefing on the military operation in the region and praised the Russian armed forces for their effectiveness. Russia's rapid assault in Kursk, including the pipeline operation, successfully cut off Ukraine's supply routes, leaving Kiev's forces encircled and in disarray. Russia has recently intensified counterattacks in Kursk, an area that was targeted by Ukrainian forces in August last year. In his report to President Putin, Russian Army Chief of Staff General Valery Gerasimov highlighted the heroic actions of the coordinated attack units, which included volunteer battalions and veteran forces. According to Gerasimov, over 600 troops used a gas pipeline to traverse approximately 15 kilometers, infiltrating Ukrainian defensive positions in a covert raid. Surprise infiltration strategy disrupts Ukrainian defenses. A specially trained unit executed the infiltration by traveling through an abandoned gas pipeline. This pipeline, which previously transported Russian gas to Europe, was shut down by Ukraine on January 1, 2025. General Gerasimov stated that this maneuver caught the enemy off guard, leading to the collapse of their defensive network and facilitating Russia's advance in Kursk. President Putin commended Russian soldiers, including the 11th Air Assault Brigade, the 30th Mechanized Infantry Regiment, and the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, for their bold and efficient execution of the mission. Additionally, over 10 other units and task forces were recognized for their role in reclaiming key territories in Kursk. Operation planned for months, executed with precision. The pipeline operation had been meticulously planned for several months before being launched in early March. The primary objective was to initiate offensive maneuvers in Ukrainian-controlled areas, forcing Kiev's forces to retreat from strategic positions and withdraw towards Svatove, where Russian troops had already been positioned for an ambush. On March 1st, oxygen tanks were delivered to the operation's staging area. The following day, Russian troops began moving through the pipeline in small groups toward the town of Svatove. The journey, which took several days, required navigating through confined spaces with limited airflow, demanding extreme endurance and skill. Due to oxygen shortages inside the pipeline, technical teams installed temporary ventilation systems and drilled air holes to facilitate movement. Although the pipeline was wide, it was not tall enough for soldiers to stand upright, forcing them to crouch as they moved. Essential supplies such as water and rations were transported via pulley systems, while soldiers wore specialized protective gear to avoid exposure to residual gases. March 8th, attack plunges Ukraine into chaos. After days of covert movement, Russian troops awaited their attack orders. On March 8th, they simultaneously emerged from pre-prepared exits and swiftly seized key positions. Russian units were then dispersed, advancing into Svatova's industrial sector and surrounding settlements. The unexpected operation caught Ukrainian forces off guard. Despite attempts to resist, Ukrainian troops were swiftly overpowered or forced to retreat, leaving behind military equipment. Russian reinforcements, including armored vehicles and artillery, were rapidly deployed to support the operation. Military analyst Eval Kilim stated the Ukrainian forces were completely unprepared. About 30 minutes after the Russian troops emerged, Ukraine began bombarding the pipeline with cluster munitions. However, by then, Russian troops had already secured the area and fortified their positions, causing widespread panic among the enemy ranks. This is not the first time Russia has used pipeline infiltration tactics. A similar operation took place in January 2024, when Russian reconnaissance forces entered Ukrainian positions in Avdiivka, Donetsk, through an abandoned tunnel. Ukraine sets conditions for lifting sanctions. Russia considers measures to ease economic pressure. Ukraine's conditions for lifting sanctions. As efforts to end the ongoing conflict continue, Ukraine has recently outlined conditions for the potential lifting of sanctions imposed on Russia by the West. According to Vlad Vus, Commissioner for Sanctions Policy under Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, the resumption of economic cooperation with Russia is only a matter of time, but it must occur under appropriate conditions. In an interview with Politico published on March 17th, Vus emphasized that economic restrictions, embargoes, and bans on Russian energy imports serve a specific purpose: to push Moscow to end its military operations and reach a long-term peace agreement rather than simply imposing punitive measures. He stated, "At present, it is too early to discuss lifting any sanctions. We only want to ensure that Russia takes significant steps in this direction before any discussions on easing sanctions take place." Vus did not rule out the possibility of European countries signing new agreements to purchase Russian oil and gas if and when the war in Ukraine ends. Russia has great potential, particularly in the energy sector, and it would be a mistake not to take advantage of it. However, we hope that Europe will never find itself entirely dependent on Russian energy in any form. Russia considers measures to ease sanctions. In a related development, Reuters reported on March 13th that the Kremlin is asking domestic companies to identify the sanctions that need to be lifted most urgently. This move comes as U.S. President Donald Trump has warned of stricter sanctions if Russia does not engage in negotiations, while also hinting at the possibility of easing restrictions if Moscow agrees to a ceasefire in Ukraine. A source in the Russian industrial sector told Reuters that the Ministry of Industry and Trade is distributing forms for businesses to fill out, asking them to specify which sanctions have had the greatest impact on their operations. According to the source, payment-related issues remain the most significant obstacle. Several businesses have reported rising transaction costs due to the need to use alternative currencies instead of the US dollar, making financial transactions more expensive and complicated. Additionally, 3 other sources highlighted energy-related sanctions, particularly restrictions on Russia's oil tanker fleet. When asked about the specific sanctions that Russia wants to be eased, the Kremlin stated that it considers all sanctions to be illegal and that they should be lifted entirely. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "These issues are part of ongoing negotiations, and I want to reiterate that there is no reason to rush into any conclusions." NATO suggests normalizing relations with Russia. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently suggested the possibility of normalizing relations with Moscow. In an interview with Bloomberg on March 13th, Rutte stated that it is natural for the conflict to de-escalate step by step for Europe and the US. And similarly, restoring normal relations with Russia should be approached cautiously and with a clear roadmap.
Russia demands full control of annexed regions, increasing pressure on peace talks. According to the Moscow Times, citing sources familiar with the Kremlin's strategy, Russia is pushing to gain full control of territories it annexed from Ukraine, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia, and Kherson, as part of ongoing negotiations with the United States. Although Russian forces have not yet fully occupied any of these regions, the Kremlin insists that all areas must fall within Russia's administrative borders as stipulated in its constitution after the annexations. A Kremlin-connected official revealed that President Vladimir Putin sees retaining these territories as politically critical and is determined to solidify control over them at all costs. The Russian constitution has no mechanism for regions to secede. "We need all of Zaporizhzhia and all of Kherson," the source added. The Russian government also hopes that Washington will pressure Ukraine to withdraw completely from areas currently held by Russian forces. One possible scenario is that President Donald Trump could persuade Kyiv to pull back, or alternatively, that Moscow will continue using military force while negotiations drag on, a scenario seen as costly, particularly when it comes to crossing the Dnipro River to retake Kherson. Another option reportedly being considered by Moscow involves expanding territorial control in other Ukrainian provinces, such as Dnipropetrovsk or Sumy, and then proposing a territorial exchange for Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. However, Russian officials acknowledge this plan also comes with high risk. The Russian newspaper Kommersant reported that President Putin wants President Trump to officially recognize Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhzhia, along with Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014, as part of Russia. In return, Putin would pledge not to claim sovereignty over other Ukrainian regions such as the strategic port city of Odessa. Currently, Russia controls approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory, including all of Crimea, 75% of Donetsk province, and 99% of Luhansk province. Moscow has repeatedly outlined its conditions for ending the war, which include: Ukraine must recognize Russia's sovereignty over the annexed regions and Crimea. Ukrainian forces must fully withdraw from these territories. Ukraine must adopt permanent neutrality. The Ukrainian military must be reduced in size. Russia must be granted official status and usage rights in Ukraine. Kyiv has firmly rejected these conditions. Earlier this month, Ukrainian Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal declared that Ukraine would not accept the loss of any territory, even if such a concession was requested by the US as part of a peace deal. He stressed that only the Ukrainian people have the authority to decide the fate of their country's territory.
Ukrainian soldiers struggle amid US aid cut decision. Ukrainian soldiers are facing serious challenges following former US President Donald Trump's decision to cut military aid. Soldiers from a mobile air defense unit near Kyiv expressed disappointment, but affirmed their commitment to continue fighting. For security reasons, they provided only their first names when speaking to Business Insider about the current situation. A soldier nicknamed Oxy stated that he does not see this as a decision by the American people, but rather by one individual. "It's unfortunate. We will keep fighting," he said. On March 3rd, Trump ordered a halt to military aid to Ukraine as part of an effort to pressure Kyiv into joining a peace process with Russia under unfavorable terms. In the following days, the U.S. also reduced intelligence sharing with Ukraine and restricted its access to critical satellite imagery. These moves have made Ukraine more vulnerable to Russia, which is gaining an advantage on the battlefield. Some Ukrainian officials reported that the aid cut has prevented Kyiv from using certain advanced weapons and has raised concerns about ammunition shortages. Ukraine's air defense forces fear that the aid suspension could impact their ability to use M2 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, an essential weapon for shooting down explosive-laden Russian drones. If we run out of ammunition for American machine guns, we will use other weapons. Even if they are of smaller calibers, we will still complete our mission, a soldier said. The deputy commander of the air defense unit, also nicknamed Oxy, emphasized that the lives of Ukrainian citizens depend on U.S. military support. We hope this issue will be resolved soon. We are defending our land, and we will continue to fight, he stated. Late last month, during a White House meeting, Trump expressed doubts about Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia. The U.S. aid reduction has sparked concerns about instability if Washington does not continue its support. Some Ukrainian officials hope the country can rely on its growing defense industry and support from European nations, but they acknowledge that U.S. assistance, especially in air defense, is crucial. Serhiy Rin, a member of Ukraine's Parliamentary Committee on National Security and Intelligence, stated that while Ukraine can manage tactical operations near the front lines without U.S. aid, Washington's involvement is vital for strategic operations. The only female soldier in the air defense unit, nicknamed Lana, said it is difficult to predict the long-term consequences of this decision. "Let's wait and see what happens," she said. Meanwhile, some Ukrainian officials warned that the U.S. decision could have severe consequences. Oleksandr Markin, commander of the Territorial Defense Forces and mayor of Irpin, a city near Kyiv, expressed shock at Trump's move. In a recent interview, he stated, "If the U.S. does not help Ukraine, Russia could expand the war into other European countries. The U.S. is the only country that can stop Russia. It remains unclear how long the military aid suspension will last." Trump has repeatedly voiced dissatisfaction with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's approach to peace negotiations. Analysts from the Washington-based Institute for the Study of War, ISW, predict that Russia may exploit the U.S. aid disruption by intensifying missile and drone attacks against Ukraine. Russia announces major victory ahead of U.S.-Ukraine negotiations. The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced a significant victory just before the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations begin negotiations in Saudi Arabia. According to information reported by TASS from the Russian Ministry of Defense, on March 11th, the Russian army destroyed the command center of Ukrainian forces in the settlement of Lebedin, Sumy province, and captured numerous Ukrainian soldiers. With the support of the Air Force and artillery, the 51st Airborne Guards Regiment of Russia's 106th Airborne Guards Division pushed Ukrainian forces out of the Lebedin area. During the battle, Russian troops discovered the Ukrainian command center and defense systems, subsequently launching heavy artillery and drone (UAV) attacks. The Russian Ministry of Defense emphasized that precise strikes weakened the morale of Ukrainian troops, allowing Russian forces to gain full control of the area. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, some groups of Ukrainian soldiers surrendered and laid down their weapons. The Russian national flag and the Airborne Forces banner were raised at the Victory Monument in the center of Lebedin. News of Russia's victory was released just before the Ukrainian and U.S. delegations began negotiations in Saudi Arabia on ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict. U.S. Special Envoy for the Middle East, Stephen Winberg, stated that during these negotiations, the U.S. would propose a framework for a peace agreement as well as an initial ceasefire. Earlier on March 10th, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced that it had taken control of the settlement of Novesk in Sumy province, a border region adjacent to Russia. AFP assessed that Russia's major victory right before the U.S.-Ukraine negotiations could significantly impact the final outcome of the talks. Additionally, according to the U.S. magazine Force, continuous attacks by Russia's elite UAV units have destroyed hundreds of Ukrainian military vehicles along the main route leading to the town of Sumy, which remains under Ukrainian control. Taking advantage of the increasingly difficult supply situation for Ukrainian tactical units, Russia and North Korea have doubled the intensity of counterattacks in the area. Ukrainian brigades in the northern region are retreating towards Sumy. The Ukrainian Defense Strategy Center warned that Russian forces are destroying bridges in the border area to prevent Ukrainian soldiers from withdrawing. With approximately 10,000 troops, Ukraine now faces the risk of being unable to retreat safely. On March 8th, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed that Russian special forces had used a 15-kilometer underground gas pipeline with a diameter of 1.4 meters to reach the outskirts of Sumy. According to Military Review, the 47th Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has begun withdrawing from the area. A representative of the 47th Brigade stated, "We have withdrawn from this area. True warriors have traveled dozens of kilometers on foot." Ukrainian losses in battles in the region have exceeded 66,000 soldiers, while multiple small resistance pockets are forming, making the situation increasingly difficult for Ukrainian forces. In Ukraine, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Alexander Syrsky, is facing heavy criticism for allowing Russian special forces to access critical areas. At the same time, the Ukrainian command has yet to propose a concrete battle plan for the forces in Sumy after the thawing of ice. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has lasted more than 3 years, and this latest development could have a significant impact on the battlefield dynamics as well as upcoming negotiations between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Trump acknowledges efforts to push for a ceasefire to prevent conflict escalation. On March 18, in an interview with Fox News, U.S. President Donald Trump admitted that his push for a broader ceasefire stemmed from his desire to keep American forces out of a potentially escalating conflict. He warned that if the war in Ukraine escalated into World War III, Americans might inevitably become involved. "We are doing everything to ensure that no Americans participate in this conflict. But that could change if the war escalates into World War III. That would be a terrible situation," President Trump emphasized. His interview came shortly after a nearly 2-hour phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump described the conversation as excellent and revealed that the two leaders had discussed numerous peace-related issues, along with other important topics. "I believe Russia wants to have a good relationship with the United States," Trump stated. During the call, President Putin agreed to suspend attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 30 days but did not accept the broader ceasefire proposal put forth by the United States. Shortly thereafter, the Kremlin issued a statement demanding that Ukraine cease receiving military aid from foreign countries as a prerequisite for a ceasefire. On social media, President Trump stated that he and President Putin had agreed to work swiftly toward achieving a comprehensive ceasefire and ultimately ending the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. He also revealed that several aspects of a potential peace agreement were discussed, including the growing number of casualties on the battlefield. Both President Vladimir Putin of Russia and President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine want to see this conflict come to an end, Trump emphasized. "The peace process is fully underway, and I hope it will achieve the desired goal."
UK, France, and Ukraine to meet in coming days to advance security plans for Ukraine. On March 31, a spokesperson for UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer announced that military leaders from the UK, France, and Ukraine will meet in the coming days to push forward detailed plans aimed at strengthening long-term security for Ukraine. According to the spokesperson, Prime Minister Starmer and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky agreed in a recent phone call to organize the meeting as part of the next phase in accelerating security planning. The call followed a summit held in Paris on March 27, where around 30 European leaders, along with President Zelensky, gathered to discuss increasing military support for Ukraine and to define Europe's role in future peace negotiations aimed at ending the conflict. The UK Prime Minister's spokesperson emphasized that following the Paris meeting, leaders recognized a real momentum to ensure lasting security for Ukraine. In a separate statement, President Zelensky welcomed the UK's efforts to promote peace for his country. Meanwhile, on the same day, the Kremlin confirmed that Russian President Vladimir Putin remains willing to engage in dialogue with former U.S. President Donald Trump. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov noted that Russia and the United States are currently working on several ideas related to resolving the conflict in Ukraine, though the process will require more time. Earlier, President Trump expressed confidence that President Putin would honor his commitments and move toward an agreement to end the war with Ukraine.